And welcome to Off-Grid Journey. I am your host, Drew Lamb, and we are live from Pyramid Pure Foods Aquaponics Farm in smoky and dry Ashland, Oregon. I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors, LadybugIndoorGardens.com and Nature'sControl.com. I'm offering a new product that you can get from them. It's a black soldier fly compost inoculator if you want to get started with farming black soldier flies and turning your compost into aquaculture feed, chicken feed, or even human feed. It's really the way to go. And you can pick that up by contacting LadybugIndoorGardens.com. Just get on their website and call them up. It's a brand new product. And you can purchase it through me. Drew at PyramidPureFoods.com is my email. And if you purchase it through me, I only take Bitcoin. So if you are a freshly minted Bitcoin millionaire, hit me up. I could use some Bitcoin. I'm very honored today to have as my guest Matthew Stein. Matthew Stein is a design engineer, green builder, and author of 2 best-selling books, When Disaster Strikes, A Comprehensive Guide to Emergency Planning and Crisis Survival, published by Chelsea Green in 2011, and When Technology Fails, a manual for self-reliance, sustainability, and surviving the long emergency, also available and published by Chelsea Green in 2008, plus a delightful new children's story, Geronimo the Frog, published by CreateSpace in December 2013. Stein is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he majored in mechanical engineering. Stein has appeared on numerous radio and television programs and is a repeat guest on Fox News, MSNBC, Coast to Coast AM, Gary Null, Alex Jones, and the Thom Hartmann Show. He is an active mountain climber, serves as a guide and instructor for blind skiers, has written several articles on the subject of sustainable living, and is a guest columnist for the Huffington Post. Matt, welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure.
Oh, Drew, it's a real pleasure to be on with you today. Thanks for having me on. So
we were talking earlier about what types of things that we should be concerned about today. I don't want to scare people. A lot of times when I get into these topics, people accuse me of engaging in the promotion of fear porn. But that's not what I intend to do, and I don't think that's what you intend to do either. I think that what we want to do is empower people and get people to respond things not from a position of fear, but from a position of love and empowerment, so that they could take on these problems that we face, be prepared, and live a good, full, and happy life. And so, that's why I like to focus on these things and give people tools and ideas, and also encourage them to start changing their way of life right now before a crisis hits us. But right now we're in the midst of several crises. We have many threats right now, from drought to Ebola to possibility of an EMP strike. We've got these nuclear power plants that are causing problems. They're all built on fault lines, and Fukushima, melting down for over 3 years now. So
yeah, the world has a lot of problems, and my books are about empowerment. Some people say, well, it's all fear, and I want to make money on fear. It's like, look, if I'd spent the time I put in my books on my engineering business, I'd be a much wealthier man right now. It's not like the books are all about making tons of money. It's kind of like a well-paid hobby that doesn't pay nearly as well as my day job. Yeah, like a tiny fraction of the day job. Anyway,
sure.
So it is, the title of my first book, When Technology Fails, the subtitle describes it well. It's a manual for self-reliance, sustainability, and surviving the long emergency. So it's helping people to have the knowledge to be able to take actions to live more self-reliantly, less dependent on all the little gadgets and things in our world. To live more sustainably. I think it's pretty clear to see the trends in the world that the way we're headed is for a brick wall, that we're collapsing the natural systems of the planet, that if we keep doing business as usual, we will soil the nest and a lot of us will die. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be that way. It just means that that's the natural consequence of the way human beings are controlling their growth and their consumption and their industrial habits in the planet right now, is that, yes, if we keep this up, we will destroy the natural systems that make life fairly livable for human beings and lots of other animals on the planet. And that's being seen right now with collapsing oceans, with forests, with climate change. We're seeing that we're headed for the wall in multiple directions right now. In fact, in the 1970s, there was a very famous book called Limits to Growth that was commissioned by the Club of Rome with a bunch of people at MIT, and it was actually going on while I was at MIT, but I was clueless about that at the time. I had no clue that was going on there. And they made a giant computer model, and they projected human beings' consumption and growth patterns and said, well, these are the natural consequences of continuing these logarithmic consumption and growth patterns, is we will collapse the planet, collapse the systems that make business as usual run, and most of us will die. But they also projected multiple other scenarios saying, like, well, if we make these choices and these choices, what's the outcome, et cetera, et cetera. And they basically said they had several positive outcomes. But what they were saying is that the closer you get to that collapse point, the closer you get to wiping out these natural systems, the much more difficult it's going to be to pull back from the edge of the cliff and prevent going over that edge of the cliff and losing most of the population and many of the species on planet Earth in our last ditch efforts to keep business as usual going and to keep the big global machine going. So, when they told that, what is that now? It's been 40 years since that prediction now. And people poo-pooed it for years and decades and said, well, everything's fine. See, all these naysayers and, it's like the guy in England who predicted that logarithmic growth of human beings would cause mass starvation. See, we avoided it, no problem. We can keep going forever. Well, I think it's really clear in the last decade that we're getting closer to that edge now, and we can't keep going forever. Because we're seeing, you're in Ashland, Oregon. I'm in Truckee, California. We're seeing this incredible drought. Things really dry. I mean, we're really lucky in my part of the world that we've avoided all major forest fires so far this year. I mean, we had 2 weeks of cold, unusually cold and rainy weather in the high Sierras with lots of thunderstorms that took the edge off of it. And finally, in the end of March and the beginning of April, we had 2 decent storms. For the first time all winter, we had a couple of real Sierra storms. We just had kind of little baby storms, like Vermont kind of storms, not Sierra storms. So, we're seeing things happening all around us. We'll take a look at the oceans, and we've got 11 of 15 of the world's major ocean fisheries are either already collapsed or on the verge of collapse. Like I was just reading an article about Cape Cod. Cape Cod is known for these codfish. Well, and it used to be just abundant, amazing fisheries all around Cape Cod and George's Banks off of Nova Scotia. And, well, those are dead. There are no cod in Cape Cod anymore. Mm-hmm. The cod are gone. George's Banks fishery, dead. Richest fishery in the world, gone. So 11 of 15 of the world's major fisheries are either collapsed or in danger of short-term collapse. We have 25% of the world's coral reefs are dead, gone. And we have 50%, another 50%, are in danger of short-term collapse or death. So that's 75% of the world's coral reefs are either already dead or are showing extreme signs of stress and potentially gone within another decade or so. So we're looking at signs all over the planet. But we are sentient beings. Human beings are supposed to be intelligent, sentient beings. We have free will. We can make choices. We can do things. Now, unfortunately, governments tend to follow and not lead. So when you think about changing the planet and preventing collapse, think about great changes that have happened in history. Think about slavery. How many slaves do you know? I don't know any slaves. It used to be commonplace. Now, Abraham Lincoln didn't single-handedly end slavery. Abraham Lincoln, there was a huge movement to end slavery in the United States. And finally, after decades of building this movement, there was enough momentum to it that they were able to put someone in power, Abraham Lincoln, to make that happen. So the government didn't lead the people. The government followed very begrudgingly, and it was very difficult change, but they made it happen. Think about women's rights, the right to vote. There was a huge women's suffrage movement, and that took decades before government followed the people and made it happen. So right now we're seeing similar things in our planet. We're seeing people waking up all over, and part of my books is helping people have the information both to deal with themselves on a personal level, like no matter if we do everything right, we're going to see some really difficult times in the coming decades on this planet. I mean, all of the damage we've done to our world and the natural systems that kept, climate fairly stable and good for human beings, all of that damage isn't just going away. But if we're lucky and do everything right, then at least we'll avoid collapse and horrendous collapse and huge die-off on the planet. But even if we do absolutely everything right, we're going to see, just because of what we've already done to our world, we're going to see some really major stuff coming down the next decade or two. And certainly by the middle and the end of the century, it's like the world's going to look very different from it looks right now. But again, it's not all about gloom and doom. It's empowerment. Right.
And and you take global warming is a real hot potato. I mean, I personally don't believe in anthropogenic global warming. However, we've got this sun that causes global warming and throws things at us all of the time. And then we have these man-made systems that pose a massive threat, like these nuclear power plants that are always built on fault lines, always built in places where there's a massive body of water, and almost always near a huge population center. And so we have a combination of things. We've got man-made problems and natural problems.
That's correct. We have a combination of things, and sometimes they can team up in really horrific ways. So I'll disagree with you about we're always building nuclear power plants on fault lines. They build nuclear power plants relatively near large population centers. Mm-hmm. And that's for a good reason financially. Basically, when you transmit huge amounts of power long distances, there's transmission losses, and that's money down the drain. That's just wasted money.
Right.
So typically they don't like to build them right next to a big city because people freak out. But for instance, there's Indian Point, on the Hudson River, yes. And they do build them next to large bodies of water because they need tons of water for cooling these things and for running steam turbines. So they are always built next to a big water supply, and that is pretty well correct. Or almost always, unless there's some country that is a desert country that decides it needs a nuclear power plant. But yeah, they still need water for cooling, so they're always near water. So anyway, 37% of the population of the United States lives within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant. I mean, that's a pretty sobering statistic. 37%, more than 1 in 3 Americans live within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant. So when you're talking about, you're talking about the confluence of natural threats and man-made threats, then the nuclear power is the perfect example of that. And so, for instance, in Fukushima, we had a natural occurrence. Earthquakes happen. I mean, there's cave paintings in the walls around Fukushima that show giant tsunamis from hundreds or thousands of years ago. These guys painted tsunami paintings in the walls of caves. So there's a natural event that happens. But, there's a lot of people in Japan. And so, and they need water. So they put the nuclear power plant beside the ocean for cooling water and, beside a big river and near the ocean so they can bring all of the stuff in to build the plant on big ships, make it easier, more economical. Well, another thing that the engineers did was 5 out of the 6 backup generators systems that are designed to keep the nuclear power plant cooling in the event of an emergency shutdown were located on the ocean side of the nuclear power plant. And the nuclear power plant was located not very far inland on a very flat plain near the ocean. So when the earthquake happened, see, what people don't realize is that nuclear power plants don't turn off automatically, and that a nuclear power plant is designed to automatically go into emergency shutdown mode anytime the grid goes down. And the reason for that is that when a nuclear power plant is producing huge amounts, megawatts and megawatts of power, huge amounts of power, and so when the grid goes down, that power has to go somewhere. They can't just like throw it away, and so they must shut the plant down immediately or it'll burn itself up with all that power that it has no place to send it because the grid is down. So what it does is immediately the control rods slam in between the fuel rods and start slowing the reaction down. Now, unfortunately, it's not like flipping a light switch. Like you don't just turn the switch and, we turned the switch and the reactor's off. The heat in the reactor core starts slowing down the reaction, slowing down logarithmically. But what that means is that if you lose cooling to the core, like happened in Fukushima, 20 minutes after they shut down, the big generators and pumps got wiped out by the tsunami. And so in the first 20 minutes, the reactors did exactly what they were supposed to do. They turned themselves off in emergency shutdown mode and started slowing down the reaction. And again, you don't turn it off like a switch. You turn it off like a switch, but then the reactor core just starts slowing down. And in fact, you have to keep these rods cooled for 3 to 5 years with water cooling after you start slowing them down, or they risk burning up. So you got to keep these rods cooling with active water cooling for 3 to 5 years. So the tsunami hits 20 minutes later, wipes out 5 out of 6 pump and generator banks to keep these things cooling. And 15 minutes later, you have 2 reactors that have gone into full meltdown. Well, there were 6 reactors on site. 2 of them were shut down already for refueling. These fuel rods don't last forever. Every year and a half or 2 years, they have to swap them out for new, fresh, hot fuel rods, and then they don't really have a great way of dealing with the fuel rods, so they tend to store them on site, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. I can't say everything at once. So 4 reactors are going. Of the 4 reactors going, 3 of the 4 have their generator and cooling systems and pumps on the ocean side, and they get wiped out by the tsunami. So only one of the 4 reactors that were going had active pump and generators that were going. That was number 6. So the emergency crews very valiantly were in there, and they struggled and they worked, and they were able to shunt power from number 6 to number 5. So number 5 had only a partial reactor core meltdown, which meant it was like a 3 Mile Island kind of event. But 2 of the other ones, I think there were 3 and 4, I forget the exact numbers, but 2 of the other ones that had full reactor meltdowns within 15 minutes because they lost the cooling pumps. That meant that the water was not going through the reactor cores, and they superheated themselves, and they burned and melted themselves up. Well, the next thing that happened, and this is actually a bigger thing because, we're going to talk about this because it really applies to us in America for multiple reasons, and we'll get into that next. So the next thing that happens then is the reactor core is melting the rods down because they got superheated. And when they get superheated, they also took some of the water that was remaining in the reactor core, and it superheated the water, and it caused it to dissociate. Water is H2O. 2 atoms of hydrogen for 1 atom of oxygen makes water. Most of us know H2O is water. That's the chemical compound. So what happened then, when you superheat the water in the reactor core, it starts dissociating into hydrogen and oxygen clouds of gas. Well, these hydrogen and oxygen clouds boiled up inside this reactor vessel. Now, these vessels are really designed by real smart guys, and they're designed with 6-foot thick concrete and steel, steel reinforced concrete walls, and they're designed to hold everything, all the nasty stuff in the event of a malfunction. Well, it's not like they get to study reactor core malfunctions all the time. They simulate them in school. In other words, you can't go to school and actually peek inside a failed reactor core and see exactly what went on. Like, it's so radioactive you can't do anything. And the whole point of reactors is to not fail. So until Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island happened, they didn't even have any failed reactor cores to look at. But they still can't really look at them because they're so poisonously reactive. You can't get inside of them. So anyway, all this concrete and steel was designed to hold all the nasty stuff in. Well, I guess they didn't figure that hydrogen and oxygen would dissociate and then boil up inside the reactor and then recombine and cause an explosion. And we saw those explosions on TV with the big giant, clouds of steam and gas and burning stuff coming off. So they blew the reactor vessel that was supposed to contain all that nasty stuff and keep it all inside. So they blew it apart. They didn't blow it into smithereens, but they blew big cracks and holes in it. Okay, so why am I talking about all this? Well, in the United States, we have narrowly missed having Fukushima-like events so far. There have been hundreds and hundreds of reactor fires and reactor incidents, most of them not too serious, but some of them quite serious. Most of us remember 3 Mile Island that happened. Well, for 3 days after 3 Mile Island happened, and I think that was back in the, I'm not sure, late 70s or 80s, for 3 days, no one knew whether or not the reactor was stabilized enough that it wasn't going to go Fukushima style. I mean, no one knew for 3 whole days. No nuclear engineers. No, the commissioner of the Nuclear Energy Commission. The NRA. Not NRA. That's National Rifle. Anyway, right? Yeah. So nobody knew for 3 days if it was going to turn into a Fukushima or not. And of course, they didn't know what Fukushima was like then, because that was decades later. But they didn't know for 3 days. So that was pretty serious. Well, another one that was quite serious, just a few years ago, if you recall, there was this huge flooding on the Mississippi River. I mean, just amazing flooding. Yes. And you see pictures of just miles and miles. It looked like an inland sea around the Mississippi River. Well, there was a nuclear power plant that was in danger of being flooded and having all the electrical controls wiped out by floods of water. In fact, it was less than 3 feet away from causing that, and they had sandbags and pumps keeping water from critical electrical stuff that keeps that reactor going. And it would have probably gone Fukushima style, and they were within 3 feet of going there. In other words, the river stopped rising. The river had risen 20-something feet. And if it had risen 3 more feet, there would have been no stopping it. We would have had our very own Fukushima in the Midwest. Oh, wouldn't that have been fun? Yes. So we've had a bunch. Now, here's the really scary thing. And this is why, to be proactive, you need to look at this from 2 points of view. You need to think about, how can I be more self-reliant for myself and my family? If there is a major long-term grid down situation in this country, what are the consequences to me, my family, my community, and how can I best prepare for that? And people say, well, why would the grid go down for that long? It's like, well, there's several possibilities why the grid might go down for an extended period of time. One possibility is, now, imagine a pandemic. We have Ebola right now. Now imagine that just as Ebola is spreading unrelentingly through Africa, and we're assured in America that it will come. I mean, I just saw a guy in Nebraska where they're treating one of the American doctors that brought back from Africa who has Ebola, and they're treating him in isolation, and they're assuring us that American hospitals and doctors are fully prepared to deal with Ebola, and we can handle it. But, apparently a lot of these doctors, Western doctors at least, and some of the top doctors in Africa who've already died of Ebola, were doing all the right stuff. They had masks, they had isolation suits, they were careful not to get contaminated with fluids from Ebola, and yet these top-notch doctors, the best doctors in Africa, are now dead. The best doctors in that area of Africa have now died from Ebola. And here some American trained doctors are being brought back here who also got Ebola. And so this guy who was with the CDC and is now at the Nebraska, University of Nebraska, I think it was, and it was just on CNN. I was just watching the clip last night. And he said, there's no way we can keep Ebola from coming to America. I mean, it is coming. It will arrive on an airplane or a boat, or people will get here and will come down with Ebola. But he says that we at least can contain it in the United States because it's not very easily transmissible. Well, I'm hoping that's the case. But it's certainly far more transmissible than, say, something like hepatitis C appears to be, which is also a body fluid transmissible and not airborne. So, because I've never heard of people getting hepatitis C who are treating people in hospitals with bunny suits on and isolation things and getting hepatitis C, and yet apparently people who are wearing all the right stuff are getting Ebola. So it's obviously something that's, it's luckily not as transmissible as the normal flu is, but it's certainly a lot more transmissible than, say, hepatitis C is, which is another body fluid-borne viral infection. So imagine now that Ebola starts showing up in large population centers in the United States, and they're not able to keep it as isolated as they claim we're going to keep it isolated in the West. And now imagine people staying home and saying, my God, if I go to work and one of my coworkers has Ebola, but it hasn't shown up yet, and I bring it home, half my family's going to die. Or people saying, if I go to work at PG&E and one of my coworkers has it, and we shake hands, and I didn't know he had it, and he rubbed his nose, or he had a nosebleed, or anything, and we shake hands, or we touch the same water cooler within a few minutes, and the Ebola is still there. I might kill my family. So that's a very understandable scenario where all of a sudden people could just stay home and leave work and freak out, and central systems are just going to fail. Okay, so that's something that's in our face right now, and I certainly hope it isn't going to happen. But there's plenty of, eventually Mother Nature will get a winning combination with a pandemic that is going to cause that to happen in human populations. It's happened throughout history. We had the Spanish flu in 1919 that killed more people. 50 million people died in a couple years around the planet, 50 to 100 million. And basically what I'm talking about happened is that public systems shut down. But you see, in those days, you could drive over the hill to the local farm and buy some eggs and butter and cheese and milk from the local farmer, or vegetables. And it wasn't like today's system. See, in those days, everything was smaller, and there was no internet, and there was no just-in-time delivery. I mean, when I was a kid, which isn't nearly that long ago, it was like in the 1960s, there was a month's worth of basic supplies stored in giant warehouses in and around every single city across America. So basically, there was a month's worth of stuff on hand to keep everything going. Well, now with days with the internet, the food on your shelves on Friday, that stocked on your shelves on Friday in the grocery store, was somewhere traveling on a truck a week earlier. Basically, we have 3-day supply in stores at all times in America now. Everything is coordinated by the internet. Everything is just-in-time deliveries. Everything is, when the machine is working well for the Great Society, the world global economy, when that machine is still working well, I mean, it's awesome to watch how beautifully everything works. But it doesn't take much to put a monkey wrench in the spoke. Think about Hurricane Katrina. Okay, when Hurricane Katrina hits, it takes the grid out, boom. Well, 3 hours later, the cell phone towers start losing battery backup supply, and you start losing cell phones in 3 hours. 3 days later, the central telephone switching systems have lost their backup power, and so the central phone systems are down. About 3 days later, the hospitals and the police stations start running out of backup power. That day, most businesses have no backup power, and refrigerators go down, and food starts melting and rotting in your freezer overnight, and air conditioners don't work, gasoline pumps don't work. I mean, back in the late 1990s, I remember my brother-in-law, Dave Marino, and his wife, Linda Marino, were driving down the Central Valley, and it was one of those days, you know the heat. I mean, you're not in the Central Valley, but up there in Ashland, you can get pretty hot in the summer.
Oh, yeah.
And in the Central Valley, you can fry eggs, right?
Yeah, they'll probably get up
120
today.
Yeah. So, Central Valley, so my brother-in-law and sister-in-law are driving down the Central Valley. It's one of those days, like 115 in the Central Valley. They pull to a gas station, and it's like everyone's sitting around in the shade, fanning themselves, and they're like, what the hell's going on here? Well, turned out that on that hot day in the West Coast, some power lines in Oregon got very saggy in the heat. They expanded in the seat and sagged, and they shorted into some trees. And the whole West Coast was like maxing out the grid because it was so hot. There was ACs running everywhere, and they had the grid maxed out. So those power lines in Oregon shorting into trees caused a cascading failure that took out power to the entire West Coast and British Columbia and parts of Alberta. And it took it out for like 6 hours, in some places a day or two in others. And so my brother and sister-in-law pulled up to the gas pumps. Well, their credit cards wouldn't work. They couldn't buy a cold soda or beer or anything in the store because the cash registers didn't work, and the money, no money machines, no cash registers. I mean, they could get water out of a hose, luckily, which eventually will fail also when the grid's down. But just all those things we take for granted just instantly stopped, and luckily it came back on. Now, let's think about another scenario, another like perfect storm between human threats and natural threats. Well, every so often the sun burps. It has something called a coronal mass ejection, and every so often, and it does this fairly often, but every now and then it burps in the direction, sends out this charged particles towards the planet Earth, and we have a solar storm. Well, roughly in the last 150 years, we've had like 100 pretty major solar storms. And what do? Well, you get these incredible northern light shows, and it disrupts communications, especially in the far north. And in the really bad ones, they have to reroute planes around, not going over the North Pole and stuff because the radiation is so strong, it can cause harm to both the electronics and the people in the planes. So that happens every now and then. Well, every really now and then, we get a giant solar storm. It's called an extreme solar storm. And this is not something like an asteroid hitting the planet that happens like 66 million years ago. An asteroid hit the planet and wiped out the dinosaurs, they think, and destroyed the Yucatan Peninsula or some big asteroid hit. And so asteroids are like, big asteroids just don't happen very often. And like, I'm really not worried about an event that happens every, 10 to 40 or 50 million years. I mean, yeah, you can worry about things, but it's like the statistical chance of that happening in my lifetime, my kids' lifetimes, is pretty slim. But an extreme solar storm, well, how often do they happen? Well, the last one was in 1921. That's not very long ago. That's like 90 years back. And the one before that was only 60 years before that. That was the Carrington event in 1860, or 1859, 1860, somewhere in there. So here you have, in the last 160 years, an average of 80 years apart, we've had 2 extreme solar storms. And you say, okay, well, what's the big deal about an extreme solar storm? Well, let's look what happened in 1921 and 1859. Well, 1921, people went outside, and this light show was amazing. I mean, the nighttime sky was lit up from the North Pole all the way to Puerto Rico and Hawaii, and from the South Pole all the way to American Samoa. So the entire planet was lit up at night except for a very narrow sliver around the very deep tropical zones right near the equator. And so what did it do? Well, it induced a lot of power surges in lines. Like in 1859 with the Carrington event, it caused a bunch of telegraph stations to burn down, and it disrupted signals around the world, and that's not that big of a deal, but it was kind of cool event, not that big of a deal. Well, in 1921, it caused a power line surge. It started a fire in a telegraph at a train station in Brewster, New York, and burned it to the ground, and it disrupted stuff around the world, and it caused a lot of shorts, and sparks were flying around a lot of lines, but not that big of a deal. Well, fast forward to today. Okay, today we have things called extreme high voltage transformers, extra high voltage transformers. They transform. In other words, when you see these giant power lines with towers that are like 100 yards tall. I mean, just huge towers, and they're like a mile between towers, or more than a mile, and these transmit power huge distances and interconnect our grid. Well, it turns out that those extreme high voltage transformers that transform our regular voltages to 350,000 to 1,000,000 volts, so that they can transmit power long distances with very low transmission losses. Remember, transmission losses is dollars down the drain. So they've developed this really, really cool stuff that transmits huge amounts of power long distances. Well, the problem is that these giant transformers are very susceptible to solar storms. Those huge runs of wire that connect, hundreds of miles apart to transformers. Those are like giant antennas, and they suck up the power from these solar storms. So we've experienced, in 1989, we had a solar storm that was strong. It was roughly 1/10 as strong as the one in 1921. That was 50% weaker than the 1859 Carrington event. So here we have in 1989, we have this really strong storm, but it's 1/10 as strong as the one we had that we're basically overdue for, that they predict in an average of every 80 years, and it's been 90 years since the last one. So we're basically overdue for the next one. And it's a crap shot. We don't know when it's going to happen. So here's a storm 1/10 as strong as that. And what does it do? Well, it totally fries one of these giant transformers in the province of Quebec. And in fact, I have an article here called A Perfect Storm of Planetary Proportions. And it's a technical journal article in IEEE, International Electrical Engineering Journal. And it says that during the first 30 seconds of the 1989 storm, the Quebec grid experienced 15 simultaneous failures, one of which was one of these massive transformers that totally cooked. And the unsurprising result was a province-wide blackout. So that's first 30 seconds of this storm. And that storm is 1/10 as strong. Well, they also lost a big transformer in New Jersey, and they lost one in the UK. And they caused some blackouts on the East Coast, but the entire province of Quebec blacked out for like 6 million people for 9 hours, and some of those people were blacked out for 2 days. Well, people were kind of worried about this because they also saw a storm in 2006 in South Africa that caused 13 or 14 of these transformers eventually failed. Not all of them failed immediately, but it caused a transformer winding insulation to burn, and eventually 14 of these transformers failed. Well, the problem is that these transformers are tens of millions of dollars each. They're 100 tons each. You have to shut down a freeway to deliver them. And they're all custom designed and custom built per installation. And here's the real clincher. There's a 3-year waiting line to get a single one of these transformers right now because of the massive electrification of the grid in India and China. The demand for these is so high that it's 3 years to get one. So what did it do to South Africa in 2006? Well, for an entire year, while the replacement transformers were being ordered and built, and they rushed them. They got them there in a year, not 3 years, because it's a rush order. The entire year, the country had rolling blackouts where they doled power throughout the entire country for a whole year. Now imagine trying to do work when 2 or 3 days out of your work week, you go to work and the power's down for 6 hours. Now, you can't buy a backup transformer because in the first hour after this happened, all the transformers in the country were bought up, and they're basically on order. They're back ordered for 6 months. So you're screwed. You can't do any of this. So they're worried. They've seen these solar storms happen, and this storm was even weaker than the Quebec storm, which was only 1/10 the size of the storms they say hit us. They say that there's a 1 in 8 chance every decade for getting one of these giant storms. In fact, 2 years ago, we had a giant CME from the sun that blasted and narrowly missed the Earth. It was as strong or stronger than the Carrington event of 1859. If our planet had been 2 weeks earlier in its solar cycle, in other words, the piece of space that giant coronal mass ejection flew through was the orbit of planet Earth, and the place that it transacted the orbit of planet Earth was where the Earth had been 2 weeks earlier. So for just the space of, if that CME had gone that same direction at 2 weeks earlier than it did, it would have been game over for us. And now here's why I'm going to explain why it's game over. And so now we just talked about how the nuclear power plants failed when Fukushima, and not directly because of the earthquake, but indirectly from the earthquake because the tsunami wiped out the backup. It wiped out the grid. The earthquake wiped out the grid. Then the tsunami wiped out the backup generators and cooling systems that keep those power plants cooled when they're in emergency shutdown. So now imagine you have this massive solar storm. So the government's very worried about what's going to happen, and they sponsored this study in about 2010 with Meditech Corporation, sponsored by Oak Ridge National Labs and also looked at by Sandia National Labs and the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense. They all teamed up on this, and they did computer modeling of the grid. And what they found was that with a solar storm the size of the 1921, realized that's a 1 in every 8 decade, roughly, statistical average event. It's been 9 decades since the last one, so we're overdue. It's a statistical crap shot. I mean, it could happen next week. It could happen in 50 years. I mean, it could happen in 2 years. I mean, you just don't know. But statistically, we're overdue. So they looked at that and they said, well, what would happen in that size event? And they said, well, with that size event, the computer models predict 370 of these massive transformers that keep our grid interconnected and keep our grid going, frying. 370. Well, how many can they make in a year in the planet? Well, let's see. When they're really going gangbusters in the planet, the average number of these transformers they make in a year is 100. If they really ramp up, they can do 200 in a year. 370. Wow. At 200 a year, that's like 14 years to replace those. Well, and actually, and then I asked the guy, John Kaplan, who wrote that, who wrote the Meditech study. He was the author of the study, and I asked him, well, what about worldwide? And he said, I don't know, I didn't study the world. And I said, what do you think, 2,000 of these transformers in the world? Well, that's a pretty good guess. Well, that's like 20 years supply of transformers, 2,000 of those, at 100 a year. That's like a 20-year supply. It would take 20 years. Now, and that's with the world working well. But most of the places that those are made in the world will be in the same situation in a massive solar storm as the United States. There'll be chaos. It'll take a long time to put things together. Now, I mean, I'm hoping that it won't be that bad of a scenario. But now, think about it. Grid down. What does that mean? No sewage plants, no water treatment, no internet, no refrigeration, no air conditioning, no oil refining, no gasoline pumping, no water pumping. Think about that. You'll be on Park Avenue in New York City, and what's going to happen? Well, raw sewage is going to start coming up through the manhole covers because there's no pumps to keep that stuff going. There's going to be no water in anywhere. People will be think duck ponds. Where does the city of 10 million people pee and poo when nothing's working? Now, think about our nuclear power plants. Think about Fukushima. How much backup fuel do they have on hand? Well, they're mandated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, to keep 1 week's supply of backup fuel on hand. And the reasoning is that the grid's never down that long, right? Right? A week. Have you ever heard of a week-long power outage in the United States? I mean, maybe out in the boonies, but not in a major metro area. Well, how long was the power down from Hurricane Katrina? Oh, that was down for months in some areas. Oh. Think about Hurricane Katrina all over the country. 100 Hurricane Katrinas happening at once. Grid down everywhere. Things fried, things cooked, nothing working, chaos in the streets, martial law. Pretty tough scenario. Now, the good news is there's a fix. For the price of a single B-2 bomber, a single stealth bomber, they've invented the hardware to protect these massive transformers in the grid from meltdown in the event of a solar storm, super solar storm. Are they doing anything? Yeah, they're talking about it. But unfortunately, they talked about the nuclear army, the U.S. Corps of Army Engineers talked about how the levees around New Orleans were inadequate, and it wasn't a question of if they would fail, but when they would fail. They basically said, Category 3 or stronger hurricane, direct hit on New Orleans. We're going to lose these levees. We're going to lose a lot of New Orleans. So they talked about it 50 years. Did they do anything? Nope. So they're talking about it now. Have they done anything? Nope. They got a bill in Congress called the SHIELD Act. SHIELD Act says private industry is going to pony up the $2 billion or so to protect the grid. So what does private industry do? They say, whoa, wait a minute. That's $2 billion out of our bottom line. That's chump change for government to spend. I mean, that's like a day in the Iraq War. But we're private industry. We don't have that money sitting around. So what do? Well, they fired the guys that had written the HILF report, High Impact Low Frequency report. That was a report that came out of a big conference on threats to the grid that identified that the huge threats to the grid, the two biggest threats were both EMP, which is a man-made electromagnetic event when some nasty country or terrorist group gets their holds of a nuclear bomb and a missile and blows it off above the Earth, and it sends out this electromagnetic pulse that fries a lot of the electronics, and I don't know if we get enough time to really go into that in detail, but it's not as bad in one sense as the books imagine. The books will have you believe that all things electronic simply stop instantly, and that's not the case. A lot of it does. Problem is that all the critical stuff stops instantly. All of the digital control systems that are hooked up with lots of wire that act like antennas, that stuff fries. The stuff that keeps your nuclear power plants cooled, the stuff that treats your water, that pumps your sewage, that runs the internet, that runs the phone systems, the stuff that makes the oil refineries and the factories go, that stuff fries. Will your iPhone fry? Probably not. Will your car start? No. Only about 1 in 7 cars will fail, actually, according to real EMP tests. But the thing that EMP does is it has these effects that are not like solar storms, which is frying electronics immediately, which solar storms doesn't have, but it also has a long, slow burn effect that does exactly the same thing as an extreme solar storm does, which will fry the grid, which will fry the transformers, which will collapse the system. The good news about an EMP is that it's a much smaller area than a solar storm. It's not like covering most of the northern and southern hemispheres, so the cavalry can come to our help from the rest of the world. The bad news about the EMP is that it will probably instantaneously fry the electronics that keep those nuclear power plants going in the affected zone. So what does that mean? That means if you got a small nuclear device and you have an EMP, and this is a man-made event. This is not a natural event like the storm. The solar storm is guaranteed to happen. We just don't know when. But statistically, it happens fairly often in geological terms, like every 80 years in the average, which means we're overdue. It's probably going to happen sometime in the next decade or two, and if we're lucky, we're in a very light solar period, and it won't happen for 50 years. But it's going to happen. We just don't know when. I don't know about you, but if I was told there was a 1 in 8 chance if I boarded that plane that it was going to crash, I would not board that plane. We're being told that every decade we have a 1 in 8 chance for this killer solar storm, and yet they're talking about it in Congress and doing nothing. Okay, not very encouraging, is it? Now, nuclear power plants. So what happens? Well, with an EMP, you're probably going to see Fukushima-like events happening almost instantaneously in the affected area. With a solar storm, or in an EMP, you're going to also see a longer-term problem, particularly in the solar storm, where they're going to run out of backup fuel. They're not going to be able to keep them cooled. There'll be mass chaos. The government's going to guarantee that diesel fuel trucks are going to show up like clockwork and keep those nuclear power plants as 104 in the United States. And it's like, yes, I really believe that, and I believe in the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus too. So hopefully we'll be proactive. We'll get our acts together. We will prevent the worst from happening. And we will get ourselves off of nuclear and off of oil. And we will make sustainability the god of our world instead of today's profit. It will put America back to work, rebuilding America for security and sustainability and a life for our children and our children's children and our children's children's children. And that's what I'm hoping we'll all do. So what do? Well, you do your best to be part of that collective change, shifting the course of our country and our world towards a sustainable future. And you also do your best to become more self-reliant, more sustainable on your own right, to have your eyes open, to not be an ostrich with your head in the sand, and to look at what you can do to prepare yourself and your family to weather these storms that are coming. And hopefully the storms will be more on the middle road or the light end of things and not the worst-case scenarios, because worst-case scenario is pretty bad.
So what do you think about the possibility of decentralized power generation as being a solution?
I think it's a huge solution. I think that the technologies most of the technology is already here, and the more we focus on that and put our money into that, then the more rapidly that solution will manifest itself. I think Germany did a great example, and in like a few years with feed-in tariffs, Germany accomplished what the Bush administration had said we couldn't do in 25 years in America, and they did it in like 3 years in Germany. So I think, and they're working towards decommissioning all their nuclear power plants, and they're working towards a decentralized grid. They're working towards distributed energy generation, and so we should put America back to work making solar rooftops everywhere in America. I mean, we could build the freeways. We can put a man on the moon. We could build all these giant nuclear reactors. We can spend trillions of dollars on the defense budget every year. It's been estimated that for 1/6, if you read Lester Brown's magnificent opus, his Plan B, I think it's up to 4.0 now or something, then it's been estimated that for 1/6 what the world spends on the military, that we could implement a plan, not to instantly, but a plan to making us within a few decades a sustainable future for the world. And we could be doing that. And 1/6 of the world's military means only 1/3 of what America spends, because we're half the military budget is spent just by the United States. And a huge amount of that is to make sure that oil keeps flowing from the Middle East to keep our lifestyle and our world and our business model going the way it's been. Problem is that business as usual is killing the planet, and so we have to make a new paradigm. We have to make a new model of doing things, or we will go down. I mean, the trends are really obvious. Everyone took math and science in high school, and you draw a graph, and if a graph is headed steeply towards the bottom, if you don't do something different, it's going to hit the bottom. Well, in my article, The Perfect Storm, I've got 6 trends, and we're all headed for collapse, and all 6 of them, are kind of converging. And so it's like, it's kind of you can make a lot of money gambling in Vegas, right? Well, which one's going to be the worst first? It's like, I don't know, my crystal ball is not that clear. But it's clear that these trends will collapse the system. We are soiling the nest. We are collapsing the system. If we continue business as usual, our society and the world as we know it is dead meat. I mean, and how bad it's going to be, and how bad can we pick up the pieces, and do most of us die? I don't know the answers to those questions. It's time will tell. It's a very exciting time to live on planet Earth. Exciting both in terms of opportunities and exciting in terms of, well, people don't like to go to boring movies, do they? I mean, it's like, oh, let's watch the grass grow. No, you go like to see a scary movie. Well, we're in it. We got this scary movie right here.
Right. No need for television. No need to go to the movies. You're in the middle of the most exciting event right now. And
it's going to get more exciting. And I'm hoping that the superheroes start showing up, but they have to be real people. And we have not yet had that Abraham Lincoln of the sustainability movement. I mean, we have not seen that leader yet. Maybe he's out there, but he's not on the world stage yet. And we certainly aren't seeing that in Obama, and we certainly haven't seen that in any Republican or Democrat that I've seen out there. And that has the potential to really run things in the right direction. So far we're just seeing a lot of talk, but we're basically our global footprint, our carbon footprints are going up pretty much every year. The only thing that's really putting a damper on our use of hydrocarbons and soiling the planet is the economy. That it's getting so expensive. It turns out that fracking is they said, oh, we're going to be the Saudi Arabia of the world, and we're going to solve all of our energy problems with fracking, and that's just a big crock, because it turns out that they're racking up. It's so expensive to do, and environmentally destructive. They're just racking up huge debt to frack. A lot of the big companies, Shell and stuff, they're pulling out of it because they can't make any money. It's so expensive that it's like selling. It's like giving their oil away. They can't make any money on it. It's so expensive, and the debt is rising tremendously. So basically, the economy doesn't do well when oil prices are over $120 a barrel, but we can't keep enough oil flowing unless oil prices are over 120. And basically a lot of this fracking is costing more like 150 a barrel. And so we're in a real bind. We're over a barrel right now. And there's no really clear solutions other than distributed generation, making this. See, when World War II happened, Roosevelt brought in the big guns in Detroit, the big industrial guns in Detroit. And he said, gentlemen, we're in a do-or-die situation here. If we do not beat Russia, if we do not rise to this challenge and defeat Germany, you're going to all have German bosses, and you're all going to be yes men for somebody else, the ones you aren't dead in the process. So I want everybody, within a year's time, I want everybody to be 100% behind the war effort. And within a year's time, they set these giant targets that they thought were totally unachievable. And they said, in a year's time, we're not going to be making a single truck or car for domestic consumption. It's all going to the wars effort. Well, they set these targets they thought were totally unachievable, and it turns out that in that year's time that they met every single target, and several of them they far exceeded the targets. And it's that kind of effort that we defeated Germany with that we could make the shift to sustainability with. We could do it. We could make that turnaround. We just haven't had the will and the leadership to make it happen at this point in time.
And I see the shift happening in a different way. Instead of a top-down approach where it's going to come from government leaders, I think it's going to come from the bottom up, from people like us who are talking about these problems, working on solutions. My whole day is focused on sustainability. I've turned it into my lifestyle and my business platform. And
it
go ahead.
Does come from the bottom up, like Lincoln. It came from the bottom up. Until the movement was huge, someone like Lincoln could never be there. But unfortunately, to make the really big decisions that really change the way the world operates has to happen at the top. Because so long as you're still putting all the money into the military-industrial complex and putting all the money into propping up oil and propping up nuclear, and when you're spending more than $10, in other words, people complain and say, "Oh, solar and wind will never do it without subsidies." Well, solar and wind gets less than 1/10 the money given in tax subsidies and hidden subsidies to nuclear and oil and gas and fossil fuels. So until we turn that tide and start spending 10 times as much on the sustainability side as we're subsidizing the business as usual side, those big shifts aren't going to happen. So ground up is important.
We're out of time, Matt. Here we go. You've been listening to Matt Stein on Off Grid Journey. I'm your host, Drew Lamb, and we will be back next Sunday. Thank you for listening.